somebody hot-footing next door to check, which is where the, or it has started.
It's just started now, yes, it's just popped up on my screen too, so thank you very much. So for those of you who are watching or have joined this virtual session for the first time, I'm just going to make some quick opening announcements to assist you, and I apologise to all of those people who've attended earlier sessions and will have heard much of what we have to say, but nonetheless I need to do it for the benefit of anyone new. My name is Carol Dillon and I'm accompanied by Louise Crosby, and we've been appointed by the Secretary of State as the examining inspectors for the Shropshire local plan. Now, looking at the participants list, I think we've met a lot of you now at the earlier sessions. Today we're going to be exploring whether the local plan has been positively prepared and whether it's justified, effective and consistent with national policy in relation to the overall approach to the strategic settlements and sites allocated by policies S19, S20 and S21 of the local plan. As you know, we've had to revert to this virtual format at very short notice, and I thank everyone for their assistance in helping us with this. And if it's your first virtual session, hopefully you've had a chance to digest the revised guidance note that's been published on the website to cover virtual event etiquette. But hopefully you shouldn't find that things play out very much differently to a face-to-face session. The key things for today are that all your electronic devices are set to silent and that your cameras are switched off unless you're being addressed by me or you've been invited to speak. If you lose connectivity, please rejoin using the link provided, and that's within your invite. And if you encounter difficulties, do please try to restart your device. That always tends to be the first sort of port of call, and often it does resolve issues. Now, the session's being live streamed for observers, and as the session's being recorded, I won't be pausing if you drop out for any reason throughout the course of the session. If you do wish to respond to any questions that relates to your representation, then please use the hands up function, and then I'll come to you in turn. And also try to remember to remove the hands up function once you've finished speaking, if at all possible, so we avoid any legacy, what I call legacy hands ups. But no doubt we all do that at some point, so not to worry if you do. Now, there'll be no cross-examination of participants, and neither will it be permissible to respond back to a point unless I've invited it, and that would be to aid my understanding. Now, please remember to speak in a loud manner so that everyone can hear you for the purposes of our discussion, but also for the recording as well, because there will be a lot of people who are relying on the recording. Now, does anyone wish to draw my attention to anything relevant to the previous sessions or the switch to the virtual format for today's session? Will you just pop your hand up if there is anything? Okay, I'll move on. Now, I wonder, first of all, if the council could give me an update on my request that I made yesterday, and that was in regard to understanding the history of the RAF Cosford site. Now, I do know that in the matter statement you did make reference to the currently adopted plan and the position in respect to that, but the representations that I've read seem to be alluding to something that's happened at an earlier stage to that. So maybe if you could just let me know whether or not you've got something for me, because it comes on later in the agenda. It was just probably more of a reminder than anything else.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Dillon. Yes, we've had a look at the inspector's report for the Bridge North local plan from 2006, and there is reference in there. From my understanding of the situation, the council itself didn't propose to remove the land from the green belt, but a third party made representations proposing that it was removed from the green belt, and the inspector did consider it as part of that request. So the council itself didn't propose it. This was obviously Bridge North District Council at that time, but it was considered at the examination of the local plan.
Okay, so if it comes up later in the discussion, at least we know what it refers to, so that's good. So I do appreciate that. Thank you very much. Now, you should all have today's agenda in front of you, and that's what we will be following. For the benefit of anyone new to the examination sessions, I'll normally address the council representatives first, and I'll also give them an opportunity to respond to any points that are raised by participants. We want to assure you that all the submissions can be taken as read, regardless of whether or not the representatives are participating today. So please focus on the scope of the agenda and the points that you made in your representations, rather than raising new concerns. For the benefit of everyone watching, please can you state your name and who you're representing at the start of your response, please. And again, that's something that we all tend to forget to do sometimes, and not to worry about it, but it just would be useful if you can try to remember. The timing of breaks will usually be around 1.5 hour intervals. This is really going to be a morning session, and it will be followed by Matter 8. So we are hoping to incorporate the comfort break into the switchover period to Matter 8. And those participants here for this session that are also involved in Matter 8 session, you should have had a separate link, and you'll need to leave this session and rejoin the Matter 8 session. But we'll, in terms of the timing, that'll become clearer a little bit later on, depending on our progress today. So if anyone's unhappy about the session as it unfolds, please do let me know, or Kerry, the programme officer, and do that straight away, please, so that we can seek to resolve any issues. Now, before we move on to the agenda, as per previous sessions, I'd just like to invite the council's representatives to introduce themselves in turn, please. And it would be useful to know whether there are particular sites or topics that you are covering today. Thank you.
I'll go first then. Yes, hello everyone. It's Eddie West. I'm the local plans manager at Shropshire Council.
I'm Daniel Corden, one of the principals at Shropshire Council, with a particular focus on housing.
And I'm Hugh Richards, planning barrister advising the council.
Liberty Stones on behalf of DIO in respect of S19 Clyde Barracks.
Steve Lewis-Roberts from Pegasus Group, representing Harworth in relation to policy S20 and the former Iron Ridge power stations.
Okay, so I recognise that you've both made your submissions, and obviously you're in support. My understanding is you're in support of the proposals. Hence, the council you've come along to support the council is what I understand. That's great. Thank you very much. So we'll start with policy S19, which relates to the Clive Barracks Turnhill site. Now, the council's responded to the questions that we posed under Matter 7 in their written response to our matters, issues and questions. And everybody should have seen those. They are on the website. And a statement of common ground has been signed between the council and the site promoter, and that's also on the examination website. Now, turning to discussion point 1 on the agenda for this site, I want to explore whether the policy is justified, effective and consistent with national policy. I've got some supplementary questions that I would like to ask the council first of all, and then I'll give the participants an opportunity to share any views that they have on discussion point 1, or anything that they've heard from the council in respect to those supplementary questions. So if I can just ask the council just to reveal themselves again on screen, and then I can start. Thank you. Okay, now I just wonder, first of all, this might seem like a really basic question, but I just want to make sure that I'm crystal clear as to that my understanding is actually correct. Could you explain the difference between the reference to a strategic site and the reference to strategic settlement, please?
Yes, of course, Mrs. Dillon. It's a reflection of the types of development that are expected on the site. So the strategic settlements are effectively a mixed-use development, which once implemented are considered to result in a sustainable settlement in and of itself. So with relation to Clyde Barracks, it will have residential development, employment development, a new local centre and appropriate supporting infrastructure. The same is anticipated on the former Ironbridge Power Station site. With regard to the RAF Cosford site, obviously that's very different. It is an existing site that is used for military and charitable purposes, and the expectation is that its identification as a strategic site and of course the associated removal of the site from the green belt will facilitate intensification and expansion of those existing activities. So it won't be a new development as such, it's expansion of those existing activities. When we come to that particular policy, we'll identify a number of opportunities that have been identified, aspirations of those site occupiers for expansion works on those sites, which we consider represent quite significant opportunities for those parties. So the strategic site is in effect facilitating that development rather than representing a new development and a new settlement in and of itself.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you very much. And could I just also check my understanding, on what basis does the proposal command, well, this particular proposal command status as a strategic site as opposed to a regular land allocation, or, you know, like just a mixed use land allocation? What makes it strategic?
I think it's the scale of the proposals and obviously the nature of the sites themselves. So when we assessed potential strategic sites, we looked at sites effectively of over 25 hectares. And these sites we consider are quite significant in and of themselves. I think the other thing is, with regard to the strategic settlements, they're not directly associated with an existing settlement that was identified specifically within our settlement strategy for growth. They are beyond that, in that they are strategic standalone locations, which are, because of their scale, considered to represent important opportunities for development. And I think that's what we tried to draw out within that distinction.
That's great. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to raise some questions about the effectiveness of the wording of the policies, and some of these questions might actually bear relevance at the scope of the questions might well bear relevance to the ability for you to be able to monitor the implementation and effectiveness of the policy. And looking through the policy for the 3 sites, I think I've got some specifics with this particular policy, but I think that the some of what you probably how your response will probably run through and be relevant to the other, to the other two sites. So it may well be the outcome of the discussion will just be something that you then go away and think about in relation to the two other policies. So I think I would suggest that we turn up policy S19. So we've got that. So we've got that in mind. Okay.
Thank you.
So just bearing in mind the content of the explanatory supporting text, which is it's relatively concise, given sort of like, you know, the scale of development that's proposed. And also in this case, a high reliance on agreeing to a master plan for the site. I'm wanting to just explore, does the frequent use of the term appropriate throughout the policy give sufficient teeth for managing the master planning exercise? So you talk about in 3C, an appropriate range of commercial uses. You talk about an appropriate transport assessment, appropriate pedestrian and cycle links. It's mentioned quite a lot through your the site requirements, appropriate. And so that term could be construed as being quite vague, potentially. So, and I'm just wondering whether that is going to, you know, impact upon the ability to agree a master plan, which subsequently will inform the what is appropriate.
I mean, my first thoughts on this particular issue is in terms of the cycle links and transport lanes, that will be very much informed by the transport assessments that are undertaken for the site. Now, we're aware that initial assessment has been undertaken as part of the site assessment process. And obviously, the site promoters themselves have undertaken initial works. But as part of the master planning process and the subsequent planning application process, there will be more detailed assessments. And I think the intention is that the site guidelines provide the high level indication of the expectations, and then that work will then inform the specific requirements. So in terms of those particular aspects, I think that's a reasonable approach. With regard to the range of services on the site, I mean, what I would say is there's been initial master planning exercises undertaken for the site by the site promoter. That's been informed by engagement with a group that was set up, a task force that was set up to inform that process. And that has informed an initial master plan, which will, if you like, form the sort of bedrock for the wider master planning exercise that will be undertaken at an appropriate stage in the process. And I think that has identified initial considerations. And obviously, paragraph 3C then provides a general indication of what that range of services is likely to include. But I do think it's important to get the balance right between providing certainty but also providing flexibility. This is a large-scale site, and in this particular instance, the site isn't going to be coming forward until 2029. So there is some time between now and then. So that would be our reasoning for that approach.
Okay. Do you, I mean, on reflection, I'm predominantly interested in policy wording, but the explanation to me seems to be quite concise, and I am wondering whether or not you want to go back and have a think about whether there is some more flesh that could be put on the bones to the explanation, if you are going to, you know, if the term appropriate is going to be retained within the policy. And that would, and really that's something that, as I say, it's a consideration for all three policies that we're looking at today, because what may be appropriate to you may not be appropriate to someone else. I think that's my point, and I take the point about flexibility, and I was anticipating that was going to be what your rationale was, but it's striking that appropriate balance between flexibility and you know, and almost like an uncertainty. So I just leave that point there with you to have a think about whether or not you could, the explanatory text could be a little bit more helpful for whoever's reading the policy.
Okay, Ma'am, if it's okay, I will just come back on that one. I think what we've attempted to do here is through the explanation, we've attempted to put the detail into the policy, and that's I think where we need to be in terms of a policy. I suppose a ratio between the amount of information within the policy and the explanation. I think good practice generally is if you want to say it in policy rather than the explanation. However, I do take your point, and I think we understand your point about trying to flesh out a little bit about what this means in practice. And clearly there has been work happening on the master plan around the site, but as has been mentioned, that is some way off an approval on that. But we could have a refresh look at that to see if there's anything from that process which we could usefully put into the explanation to give the reader a bit more flavour of actually what's happening and what is expected to happen in the future. I will obviously make the point, we're not approving a master plan here. That's not the role of the policy. The policy is a hook for future master plan preparation, but we understand the point and we can take that under consideration.
Yeah, and as I say, if you could just, in terms of the other two policies as well, if you have it, it's a bit of a common theme. Thank you. Now, just again, just some wording there. We've already touched on we've had a discussion around the use of the word around when we're looking at quantums of development, and we have a reference to around 750 dwellings and around 6 hectares of employment land, and we also have extensive green infrastructure, which again that's quite a it doesn't actually quantify as such. And we also have a small number of modest retail, reference to retail units there. So they're all sort of quantums, but there is they're not precise. So again, it's that thing: is the policy sufficiently clear on the quantum of development which is being proposed here?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Dillon. In terms of the quantum of development, I think, again, I mean, the starting point is there needs to be a level of flexibility, because obviously the master planning process itself will flesh out in more detail the specific number of dwellings and amount of employment land. What I would say is the work that's been undertaken by the site promoters thus far indicates that those levels are about right, but obviously there's inevitably going to be a slight adjustment, if you like, in the level of dwellings once the more detailed master planning and planning application process is undertaken. So that's why we consider it was appropriate to use that sort of around 750 dwellings and 6 hectares of employment land. I think the other thing is it's important to remember is this policy is part of a wider plan, and the plan needs to be read as a whole, and that obviously has a number of policies that will influence the development of this site. And green infrastructure is a really good example of that. We have a specific policy on open space provision and also a specific policy about green infrastructure, and those policies will of course inform the development of this site in the same way that inform the development of every other site that comes forward through this local plan process.
Can I just come in there? So we talk, this policy specifically refers to green infrastructure, but I do note that it doesn't refer to open space provision. But I think the the other policy, the next policy, I think it does. So I was wondering, is there a reason, is when you talk about green infrastructure, is that, does that incorporate any open space requirements? Is that reference, or is it something that's been omitted purposefully, or has it been omitted unintentionally?
I'll just come back on. The intention of the approach to open space and green infrastructure is for effectively the green infrastructure to form part of the open space for the site. It's not as well as, it's when you incorporate open space into a site, the policy of green infrastructure is applied to look at opportunities in the site to link areas of open space in a network of open space effectively through green infrastructure. So that's referenced within the development management policies to the plan. I bet you bear with me, or DP15 and DP14 of the plan cover our approach to open space provision and green infrastructure, and explain what I've just attempted to explain about the link between the two. So it is one and the same thing. It's about how you deliver the open space on a site.
Yeah. Okay. So that would include any, would that include children's play space, that type of thing? Does that fall within, you take that as fall within the scope of green infrastructure?
Correct.
Yeah, right. That's again, I think it just goes back to potentially the explanatory text issue that I had before, because it was that I think you've taken a slightly different approach with possibly with the Iron Bridge. Yeah, it must have been the Iron Bridge that caused me to reflect on what green infrastructure actually meant. So again, it just suggests.
Yeah, if I may just come back on that point, Mark, about, and it might be one from a colleague to come in on as well here about this, particularly about Iron Bridge Power Station. Obviously, we are at a much more advanced point in the delivery of that location, yes, the former Iron Bridge Power Station, and we'll come on to talk about that, I'm sure. But obviously I suppose the point here, or the argument, is that the book within the policy hasn't hindered that process into a successful application process on that particular location. But I take the point, and also I think probably within the policy on the Iron Bridge power policy, there is it has reflected a more advanced appreciation of the where we are in the development process, which isn't the case with S19. So I think it's a little bit about where you are in the process and what information we've got to support the policy. But I take the point in the round, I think, on this one, about potentially to flesh this out. Yeah, okay.
No, that's fine. I think it's because of the slightly different approach, because you've obviously, as you said, Iron Bridge is that concept is further advanced. But in doing that, it just potentially creates a little bit of inconsistency in terms of your reference, and that can then lead to some result in a policy that's not as effective, because it's not as clear. You know, you've got an element of I don't know the word it's not necessarily contradiction, but there's an inconsistency between approaches. But I think you get my point there. So I think it's a case of just having a reflect on this discussion. Now, just turning to your matter statement for matter 7, in relation to this particular site, paragraph 1.12. What was it? Right, reference. Yeah. Okay. Paragraph 1.12. I'm just wanting to, there's a statement here which I'll just read out for the benefit of everybody. Importantly, the detailed policy requirements which are set out in there in principally in point 3 of the policy. So the detailed policy requirements ensure that the overarching strategy is deliverable. And obviously I've read the remainder of the the matter statement, but that particular statement is sitting in a bit of isolation, and I don't, to be quite honest, I don't understand what you mean, what it means. I just wanted to be sure what was meant by that.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Dillon. The point of that statement was effectively it was concluding the points that we were making above in terms of the fact that the guidelines for the site provide the structure for the master planning process and the subsequent planning applications to ensure that those factors are taken into account, and those factors effectively set the strategy for the development of the site. So in effect, it's what it's saying is
right,
that make sure that the strategy is deliverable as through the development process.
Right. Okay. It's the yeah. It's the word strategy that's thrown as.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Right. Okay. I can understand that now. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay. So this question that I've got for the council, you'll be straying into, it's about wording of the policy, but it sort of strays really into monitoring, which I know we're dealing with in matter 8, but nonetheless I think it's probably appropriate to, because we're looking at this whole policy, I think it's appropriate for us to look in it. It relates back to wording and effectiveness of the policy, so I'd like to deal with it now if we could. So what I'd like to know is, how will the progress and effectiveness, the progress in implementing this policy and its effectiveness be assessed in the absence of any tangible targets and baseline indicators either in the policy or in the monitoring framework? And that framework's at the back of the plan, around about page 343. I know that the statement of common ground between the council and the site promoter agrees phasing will be agreed sometime in the future, and policy, and we've got the likes of policy DP 25. But there's some elements of the, so so that's the high level question, but then I've got some examples. So in terms of 3C, which is about the local centre comprising an appropriate range of commercial uses, that refers to its timely provision. And I'm just wondering what is meant by timely, and is it sufficiently specific to be effective? And I'm thinking about the question about what level and type of development can occur before the local centre has to be delivered. So thinking it in that way, does that make sense? Does that make sense to you, what I'm getting at?
Yeah, Mr. Dillon, I understand your point to be, when in the development of the site will the local centre come forward? When would it be appropriate for that to occur? And I think it's a good question, and our response to that would be that would be something we determine through the master planning and the planning application process. It will identify when in the phasing of the site that would be appropriate. And then in terms of monitoring that would be, of course, the level of retail provision made on the site.
But the master plan itself won't have a planned state. It won't have like a policy status as such. So it goes back to, I think, what teeth have you got? to determine what is timely and to make sure that development, for example, all of the housing occurs, but you don't have a local centre. Because it is a, these the provision of infrastructure can have, you've got quite substantial viability considerations, and delivery of these things that isn't, has to be sort of finely tuned and well thought out, so that you don't end up with a quantum of housing that doesn't have the services to support it because market conditions don't allow it. So it's, there'll be examples up and down the country of this type of thing, that on paper it's all, theoretically it's all very sustainable and ideal sort of world type of scenario, but the reality can be very different. So it's just whether or not the policy has actually got the enough teeth to be effective. And I understand that the argument about flexibility, but it's ensuring that you're not being so flexible that the policy is not effective in being able to deliver what needs to be delivered.
Yeah, you understand the point actually, and it is it's a good point, and obviously we want to avoid on inappropriate development on the site, or development of an inappropriate scale and nature. But I think we do have to go back a little bit to principles about what we're doing with this local plan as opposed to planning application. But in our view, we see it as a phased approach here. You have the local plan with the policy as we've prepared, and I fully accept the point. We can have a consideration about if we need to, what we can seek to do in terms of fleshing out the information, particularly around the explanation. But obviously it sits where it sits in a strategic policy in a local plan. The policy itself specifically refers to the master plan for the site, which we've already mentioned is relatively early on in its iteration, but will hopefully make more progress as we move forward. But it specifically talks about that the master plan will be prepared and agreed by Shropshire Council, adopted by Shropshire Council. And the view is, I mean, it might well be worth here if it's a particular concern about the teeth of that master plan in seeking to guide development. It might be as simple as, wrong phraseology there. So it might be a main modification here to say adopted by Shropshire Council as a material factor in the eventual decision making on a planning application. That might be a way to beef up the plan, I suppose, in that context. I would say that this is an approach we have used before on SUE type developments, particularly around in our current adopted local plan, where we have a fairly strategic policy supplemented by a master plan, which is not part of the development plan, but is agreed by Shropshire Council as material in decision making, and that master plan has then gone on to be a material factor in decision making on the phasing and uses on that SUE. So, and that has happened over the course of the last 6 or 7 years on a couple of SUEs in the Shropshire area. So we do think it's a tried and tested approach in terms of the policy master plan application. But equally recognise that we could perhaps look at main modifications here through potentially some wording changes, or including some wording around material considerations potentially. I don't know whether that would support or get to the heart of your concern.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether you need to link it back as well to a some sort of phasing plan being agreed.
Yeah, okay. That
I think
sounds
that
like
was
a
where I
sensible-
was coming from.
sensible
And then what
suggestion.
that means is your phasing plan becomes the bit, it's part of your complying with the policy, and that phasing plan, then the targets and timescales within that and quantums of development then become the basis for the monitoring framework. And then you've got specific components, specific figures and timescales that you can monitor and then determine whether the policy is being implemented in the manner that it should be. So that's where I think that's where I'm coming from. So that would be something that you
And,
might want to consider.
yeah, and obviously we would need to do that with the site promoter as well, and it might well be an update to the the policy through main modification here. It's certainly something we can consider, and I'm getting some nods here to suggest that that's a good idea. So yes.
Make a note of that. And that's something I think that runs through the other policy. It's an issue that runs through the other policies as well. Because it as well, I'm thinking about 3E. So in terms of the educational provision, because obviously that can be quite a concern, quite emotive subject for the community. And when you're talking about large quantums of housing development, pressure on school places, etc. Again, it's that would be captured within within a phase, and could be captured within a phase and plan to make it to give certainty as to when a school needs to come on stream, because obviously a school doesn't necessarily although sometimes they do arrive on the back of a wagon now with the but it's something that isn't, there's a lead-in time for that type of thing as well, and where everything goes, and sequence of events, etc., needs to be clear.
Yes, that's a good point as well, and you'll probably hear a little bit later today under matter 8 as well about our approach to sort of infrastructure provision more generally, but and particularly around education, about our work with our education department here at the council, and around their plan making process for school place planning comes into that as well. But certainly as part of that process, we would want to ensure, and they would want to ensure as well, through whether it be this process, a master planning process, and definitely through a planning application process, that education facility is delivered.
Yeah.
I'll avoid using the word appropriate points in the time, but
Yes. We do all use the word appropriate. I haven't got a it's just the using it in a particular context. So yeah. And can I just also ask, obviously the policy it refers to employment development coming alongside housing development. So again, I think that links back to sort of capturing that within some sort of phasing plan. But I'm just wondering, what evidence is there to give comfort that employment development will come alongside the housing development, and what would be the position if it didn't? At what point? Because there isn't anything in the policy again to sort of indicate at what point would that become a concern. So again, that leads back to the lack of those monitoring indicators and targets. So So again, that might be something you want, you might have some thoughts on that you want to share, or it might be something that you want to go away and obviously think about as part of that.
I think we understand the point very clearly. I think the concern that you're raising is the policy is pitched at a level which is too strategic in your view, and that there needs to be further clarity on certain aspects, particularly around when things happen on the site in terms of particular uses, to guide initially a master plan and then subsequently a planning application, and then it being in order to monitor the effectiveness of the policy in a more rounded manner.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the point you're making. I think we would certainly welcome the opportunity to reflect upon that, discuss with the site promoter, and to come back with a some suggestions on that point, which might go some way to easing any concern you had on that.
Okay, thank you. And yeah. And just because I can't resist it, on point 3L, I think you might have an apostrophe missing.
Yes.
It could actually, I don't know, could have a bearing at some point in the future in an appeal, or you know, it's one of them. But I think it's because I work as I work with more than one inspector. I've got a sharp eye for apostrophes.
You're quite right, Matt. And we'll get our red pen out on the flag. But no, it's well spotted.
Thank you. And just on 3H, can I just, where we're on sort of like precision and effectiveness, 3H talks about, it's about the sort of acoustic design. And can I just to clarify that, is that just in relation to internals, or does it also relate to external areas? So I'm thinking garden areas, for example.
It's still in that refers to internal, not
Okay.
not
So
external.
again, that is something that it's not particularly clear that would be the case, and obviously there are noise issues can be quite sort of significant to development. So again, I know that would be informed by all my modelling and various technical reports, but I think just to you may want to think about the clarity in terms of the scope of that for the policy to be effective.
Yes, that's something we can reflect on.
Yeah. And then just, sorry, going back to 3A, that talks about the quantity, quality, design, mix and layout. And I'm just wondering, is there really a need to be referring to design quality in 3A in the context that it doesn't seem to sort of fit within what that criteria is trying to achieve?
I think in that particular context, I think that was a reference to recognition that obviously the site has some existing built form on it that may influence the design of the development itself. So that was why it was down to the site constraints and opportunities, because there are some characteristics of the site that may be carried forward in the eventual development that takes place. And I do believe that's consistent with our sort of wider approach to high quality design within the plan, which sort of recognises the fact that existing form can influence the built form of development.
So is it a case that you've got maybe a comma where you shouldn't have a 1. If the quality is about design quality. It just doesn't.
I'm wondering here, if the policy could be improved for potentially by cross-referencing to other policies within the plan as well. I mean, in that instance, high quality design policy SP5 in that context, but the same could apply on other policies as well. I do note that we haven't done that specifically in this policy, and that might help to clarify that.
Yeah.
Obviously, I know this sort of the old adage of a plan should be read as a whole, but it also I recognise the benefit to the decision maker at the point in time to cross-reference specific bits of the plan, which would be particularly helpful for the decision maker to cross-reference to. So. Or
it may well be that it's because of the explanation. It's the explanation isn't and I know that the explanation isn't policy, but if you have an explanation that's appropriate, if you've got a robust explanation text, then that helps the reader interpret the policy, and then that in turn turn influences how the degree to which the policy is effective.
Yeah, okay, we understand that. I think it goes back to the point that you've made about the explanatory text, and we can include such issues as cross references within the explanation and seek to expand upon that text in that way as well. So yes, we can take that under consideration.
So that really, this discussion that we've had, I don't think there's anything specific. Really, it's the same thing again. We'll be having a repeat discussion on the other 2 policies. So what I do is just ask that you take that away as a whole and apply it as it to the other 2 policies, where appropriate. We're going to be using it at appropriate, aren't we? So it's one of those words now that's going to crop up. Right. Okay. So we move on now. Now, I think really these were things that they weren't matters that have been picked up by the representatives necessarily. That's in my assessment of the effectiveness of the policy, which is part of the soundness issues. So I'd just like to does the council wish to expand on what they've said in there? Because obviously you've made your response to this matter discussion point within your hearing statement. Is there anything that you want that you feel that you need to draw attention to, or can I just open it up to see if anyone else wants to say anything and then you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that sounds a sensible approach.
Yeah. Okay, then. So just going back to the nub of discussion point 1. Is the policy justified, effective and consistent with national policy? Now, when you're, have we got anybody who wishes to speak on that? Okay, don't have anything. So I propose, council, that we that we move on to the next discussion point. So this next one really links to discussion point 4 as well. So I'm going to deal with these together. We had some representatives have expressed concerns about the timeframes for delivery. Are they being over ambitious, bearing in mind delays in the site's release and the infrastructure requirements that are required? And obviously we've had that discussion about a potential for looking at how you look at delivery across the site and manage that. Now, the policy states around 750 dwellings will be provided overall, and delivery within the plan period itself, as shown on the trajectory, has been reduced from 500 to 350 units to be delivered in the second part of the plan period. So I'd just like to explore, is the housing trajectory for the site realistic and deliverable? And I'd be interested to know how that delivery rate has come about and whether it takes account of other development outlets within the wider locality, or whether it's based on the assumption that there'll be more than one outlet on the site itself. So when I talk outlet, when I say outlet, I'm referring to more than one developer developing different different parts of the site. And I'd also like you just to reflect on, does the proposed modification of that reduction of 500 to 350 units, does that place any risk upon the ability to meet the housing requirement over the planned period? And will it affect the timing and delivery of other land uses proposed? And if it does, have the implications of that been assessed? So I'll ask the council first of all, and if you need anything repeated, because there's a number of points that I'm making out there. So we've got that initial that reduction, is that 350, is that realistic and deliverable? How's that been evidenced, and what's been taken into account in coming to that delivery rate, and then its impact upon the timing of the delivery of other land uses?
Thank you, Mrs. Dillon. In terms of the change to the amount of delivery in the plan period, obviously our matter statement explains the reasoning for that. In effect, the site is going to be released at a later date than originally anticipated. In terms of our delivery assumptions, they've been very carefully considered based on our understanding of the market and also discussions with the site promoter. And you'll note that the actual trajectory that we assume in our land supply and that's documented within our matter statement is also consistent with the trajectory that's within the statements of common ground with the site promoter themselves. Our view is that trajectory is realistic and robust and has had careful consideration to factors such as the infrastructure requirements and lead-in periods. So we consider that approach to be realistic, and we consider it will make an appropriate contribution to our housing land supply consistent with our assumptions. In terms of the impact on wider delivery, obviously we've undertaken an updated assessment of our housing land supply, and that assessment has taken account of the changes in terms of when this site will come forward. We consider that we have a robust supply and it will allow for the delivery of the housing requirements across Shropshire. So we consider that the implications of that delay have been appropriately reflected within our wider assumptions, and we consider we have a robust position in terms of delivery. With specific regards to the site, maybe if I hand over to the sort of site promoter, who can give you a bit more information. So if I could just pass you over to Ms Stones, and she'll be able to give you a bit more information.
I'm not sure there's much more to add, but as it's already been mentioned, the revised vacation date comes around, and that's a result of a sort of that's ministerially led, but follows a far more detailed and robust review of the MOD's reprovisioning programme. So we're fairly confident that that date now is the date we are working to, it provides a significant lead-in time for us to continue our discussions with the council, stakeholders, the task force group that we've been working with since 2016 to work up our proposals, to review the phasing, to review the master plan and how the site sort of will come forward, so that when an application is submitted, it's robust and we're ready to go and dispose of the site sort of immediately. In respect of the trajectory that has been proposed in terms of build out rates, as discussed, that has regard to past delivery rates in the area, but it also does have regard to the local market absorption rates and having regard to what we know will be coming forward at similar times should the plan be adopted. And there's an element of professional judgment in there from sort of experts in sort of that area.
Is there, I think this might be one for the council, is there, can you point me to, is there written evidence on the local market as some absorption that you can point me to?
I think that's sort of embedded within our approach in our housing land supply. So when we make assumptions in terms of when sites are going to come forward, they are informed by our engagement with site promoters. So it's embedded in those assumptions itself.
So you haven't done some sort of, there isn't a document somewhere that, I mean, I haven't come across it, but I just want to clarify, there isn't a piece of evidence that looks at sort of what you refer to it as local market absorption, but
I think
about looking at, you know, something that evidences delivery rates across the county, because obviously you've got a very diverse county and therefore delivery rates may vary. It may be very granular. Is it a common assumption? I don't want to, because this will be for another time, but it would be good just to get that clarity whether or not there is something specific that you can direct me to.
Yeah, so there isn't a specific document, but what we've done is the assumptions in our housing land supply are directly informed by, as I say, first and foremost, we have identified 3 differential rates for Shropshire in terms of the sort of standard delivery rates, and they were informed by discussions with the developer forum. And yeah, the rates in the north are, I think it equates to 25 dwellings per annum as the starting point. And we have higher rates in, I think it's the Shrewsbury in the south, isn't it? So we have sort of 3 differential rates as a starting point. But as we explained within the housing land supply, those are then refined through specific discussions with the site promoters.
Okay.
Because as Ms Stones has just drawn out, the site promoters themselves will be looking at sort of they'll have their proposals in terms of how the site's going to come forward, informed by their understanding of the market and their specific sort of assessments in terms of what they're expecting. So that sort of refines our assumptions, and that's what's reflected in the housing land supply.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of delivery rates, obviously we do take account of what happened in the past, and that, you know, that's part of the discussion that informs what's going to happen moving forward. So we believe that's sort of embedded within the actual housing land supply assessment. It is based on our understanding of the market and our understanding of site-specific factors as well.
Okay, thank you. So before we move on, does anyone have anything, any of the participants wish to say anything about discussion point 2? I don't see any hands raised, so we'll move on. Okay, so this next discussion point relates to whether the infrastructure requirements have been adequately identified and costed. And I've got the council's response to that discussion point in their matter statement. Is there anything that the council wishes to elaborate on or draw my attention to? Otherwise, I just propose that I would take that written submission as read, apart from highways and healthcare, which I do have some supplementary questions. Is there anything?
Mr. Dale, I'd say if you take our statement as read, although I would add to that, the statement of common ground obviously is of relevant consideration as well.
Yeah. So just again for the council, so in terms of just highways, in terms of the road improvements, is the deferred approach that the policy takes to assessing the scheme for any impacts on the strategic road network and the local network, and any necessary mitigation and the means to secure it, is that a sound approach?
Thank you, Mrs. Dillon. As part of the site assessment process, we undertook initial sort of highway assessment work that informed of site selection process, if you like. But there has been further work undertaken by the site promoter at this initial stage. And perhaps if I hand you over to Ms. Stone, she'll be able to give you a bit more information on that.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's actually covered out in paragraphs 5.6 to 5.10 of the statement of common ground 06.
Okay.
But essentially, we've undertaken a highways report and technical note, which explores the site capacity. It models it for I think it does 800 dwellings rather than 750, just to provide that flexibility. That identifies the sort of improvements that we know about already, minimal improvements to the site junction, and we know that the roundabout just north of the site is at capacity already, and so we've undertaken work to explore what improvements can be made to that roundabout. That's set out in the statement of common ground as well. So that will involve taking a bit of highways land to improve the capacity of the 3 junction points. But beyond that, there are no other areas identified.
Just to expand on that, I think it is important to recognise, obviously, this is a strategic approach that we've taken. And obviously that particular point is picked up in the site guidelines, paragraph 3F. I think it's also important to recognise, obviously, that the site isn't expected to come forward until 2029. So obviously, whilst we've got an understanding of the highway issues, I think it's important to recognise that given the fact that it's not coming forward until then, we do need a level of flexibility, because the situation could be somewhat different at the time that development takes place. And that's why it is important that the development management process, which provides an opportunity to look at a site in much more detail based on detailed proposals, is the sort of key point in the process when these issues are drawn out. So we feel that the balance is right on that issue, recognising those sort of different factors.
Thank you. Just moving briefly on to healthcare, and this relates back to the duty to cooperate discussions that we had, and the recognition, I think, between yourselves and the NHS family, that they hadn't, the discussions hadn't been as advanced, shall we say, but things have now been put in place to improve that. So I'm just thinking in terms of this particular policy, and actually it runs through to policy, the next policy as well. Iron Bridge. Have the concerns of the NHS that were expressed in the regulation 19 stage about the healthcare infrastructure, has the policy has that been resolved in terms of the way that the policy's worded, or I suppose what I'm asking is, should any requirements be reflected in the policy? Because I think for Iron Bridge, obviously there is reference, but in terms of this policy that we're looking at now, it doesn't appear to be particularly clear.
Thank you, Mrs. Dillon. Yeah,
I think it's that if required. I think it'll fall under 3E, won't it? Because you're talking about the primary school and community facilities and buildings. If relevant, CCGs and medical centre will also be provided on the site. Is that sufficient to overcome? Because the NHS issue is wider than it's wider than just immediate local provision, isn't it? I.e., doctor surgeries. It's a wider issue.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Dillon. Dealing with Clyde Barracks first, our engagement with the CCG didn't indicate a specific aspiration to provide medical facilities on site, which is why it isn't specifically referenced in the site guidelines. Clearly, in terms of our approach to infrastructure provision, that's very much documented in policy DP 25, which talks about community infrastructure levy in section 106 as the sort of main vehicles for funding infrastructure. All developments in Shropshire that results in the formation of one or more dwelling is subject to the community infrastructure levy, and that would be our main vehicle to deliver infrastructure improvements. DP 25 then talks about circumstances where section 106 may be required in addition to that. In terms of NHS facilities and dealing first with sort of medical centres, if you like, our expectation is that any required improvements off-site would be funded through those mechanisms. Dealing with more widely with regards to NHS facilities, I think we've discussed this previously under different matters, but we've got a strategic infrastructure network that's been set up, and that will continue that sort of proactive engagement with infrastructure providers, including the NHS. And that process will be utilised to identify sort of wider infrastructure needs. And again, our delivery vehicle for those infrastructure needs is the community infrastructure levy in section 106 approach in DP 25. So we feel we've got an appropriate mechanism to deliver that infrastructure. But I don't think there's any particular suggestion that there's specific on-site provision required in this particular instance. It's more widely how that's supported. With regard to the former Iron Bridge power station, I think earlier in the process, our understanding had been that there was an aspiration from the CCG to provide on-site medical facilities. Now, as I understand it, through the planning application process, the CCG's position has somewhat changed, hasn't it? I think they're looking for a financial contribution to meet provision off-site. But perhaps if I hand over to Mr. Lewis Roberts, who's the representative of the site promoter, he can give you a bit more detail on that particular matter.
Yes, certainly. In terms of Iron Bridge, the initial discussions with the CCG suggested an on-site provision, and I think that's reflected in the policy. But through the planning application process, there was very extensive discussions with the CCG, and they concluded that an off-site contribution was more appropriate response, and therefore there's a contribution of £913,000 being agreed to be paid to the CCG for locally improved health facilities. Thank you.
If I may also just add to that, Marm, it was just a point you made about the cooperation between ourselves and the CCG and the NHS group. I wouldn't want to, I suppose, label that as ineffective at all. I think it has been an effective process. I think what we're talking about here, and what you'll probably hear a little bit more under matter 8 this afternoon, is that that process is evolving into a wider network, which will certainly, in our opinion, improve the situation. But we do think those conversations with the CCG, and again, a point to be made here is obviously, who are we talking to in the NHS? And in this instance, the CCG were the right people, because has ended up with a financial contribution as part of a planning application agreed on a strategic site. So it has, I suppose, for all intents and purposes, the system's worked in that context.
Okay, thank you. And before we move on to, well, we've already covered discussion point 4, because that was part of our discussion with under 2. Is there any of the participants wish to raise any points regarding either the highways or health issue, or any of the other topics that are listed on the agenda, in the likes of air quality, the primary school, the green infrastructure, etc., that are listed under discussion point 3. Yeah, I think I've had Mr. Hanson. No, Mr. Hanson, yes.
Good morning, Mum.
Good morning.
I'm Neil Hanson from National Highways, who used to be Highways England.
Yes, hello there.
On the 19th of August last year, we were rebranded National Highways. I think everything's been covered in the statement of common ground, and the information our responses we gave you earlier, and written responses. However, if there's any points that you want to, any issues that you want to raise, be happy to try and answer them.
I think it's going back to that, whether the approach, that sort of what I called a deferred approach, whether that was something that was sound. Is that something that you're comfortable with in terms of strategic road network?
Yeah, on the strategic road network, we follow a plan-led system, and so these will be in the document if appropriate. I'm using it now.
We'll all be very aware of that word now.
But come planning, come a planning application, we're a statutory consultee, so anything that may affect the strategic road network will be consulted on. We will then look at the planning application and transport assessment, consider it, and if there's any mitigation works, we will condition those as part of the planning application response, and suitable conditions to protect our interests, and so there's no risk to the safety and free flow of traffic on the strategic road network. Okay. I just would add that we've got our roadmap to net zero, and we're fully bought into making our roads net zero, and we've got a document to do that, which is our roadmap to net zero, net zero highways, our 2030, 2040, 2050 plan. And one thing to note, that by 2050 the aim is to get all vehicles on the network to net zero, so that's the aim.
That's lovely, thank you. And there aren't any participants have raised any highway issues, so that's fine. That's all I need at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. And then again, if I can just refer back to the council, if I can just, when we move on to discussion point 5. and again, this is something that cuts across all of the other site allocations that we were going to be exploring today. So, and it's about whether a map or plan identifying specific allocate, like the areas of development components should be included within the plan. I mean, on this, I've got you the council's written submission in regard to it. So I'm just proposing to take that as read and to move on, unless there's anything that you want to add.
No, I don't think that's necessary. Thank you.
And I don't recall that any of the participants actually raised it as an issue either, so I'm just intend to move on. And then just on to discussion point 6. Should the policy be more prescriptive about the types of employment and other commercial uses to be permitted? Is it too flexible in terms of the breadth of the uses that could occur, which might detract from the vision of the site? Vision as in, I mean detract from the site promoter and council's vision of the site, not the look of the site as such. And is the policy adequately future-proofed to anticipate revisions to the use class order and maybe new forms of employment uses that will come on the horizon? Because obviously this is a long-term plan, and a development that'll extend beyond the plan period. So I'd just like to hear the council's views on that.
Thank you, Mrs. Dillon. Yeah, our approach, I mean, we've talked about flexibility previously, and I think that is the key point. That's why the approach we've taken in this particular policy, and also the other strategic sites settlements, is that approach. I'd also suggest that's very much consistent with how we've approached employment provision more widely within the plan. When you look at policy SP13, there's a recognition of the need for flexibility in terms of the types of uses that are appropriate on employment sites. We feel that approach, as you've already sort of talked about, responds to the fact that these sites do take place over, well, the actual development of the site takes place over a number of years, and obviously with regard to Clyde Barracks, it won't be coming forward for a number of years. So the type of employment that's appropriate at that time and the opportunities available may be different to those that are available at this time in the process. So we consider the approach embedded within the plan in this particular policy as well is appropriate in terms of balancing that that need for flexibility to respond to the opportunities in terms of employment that may come forward.
Thank you. And presumably, as the plan would be read as a whole, are you satisfied that should, I know you're gonna have a master plan, but it should a development proposal come from left field, that is a more unneighbourly, shall we say, or you're satisfied that the plan would be able to respond to that? It would be effective in managing any such proposal.
Yeah, I would just say on that point, it sort of goes back to the previous point really about almost sort of a sequential process about building up the information around the site, leading up to a planning application. Eventually, obviously, we've got a little a fair run in on this one in getting the master plan. I won't use the word appropriate. But the point being is that the way the policy is worded clearly sets a suggestion that the master plan will be adopted by Shropshire Council. Now, if Shropshire Council aren't happy with the master plan, we won't adopt it. And obviously, we are part of that process as well. We are part of the group who are.
And it goes
involved
back
in
to
preparing
that.
it.
And it
Yeah.
goes back to that modification that you were talking about before about, so yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
We can move on from that. And this is we'll move on to discussion point 7. And again, this is something that it cuts across all of the, oh, sorry, yeah, discussion point 7, which wasn't in the matters, issues and questions. So this is a new thing. This is something that's occurred to us since. Obviously, we've heard about this being a strategic site. Our policy S19, 20 and 21, should they be included in the strategic policy section of the plan as opposed to its current position at the back of the plan?
Our view on that is that where they sit in the plan is appropriate because it's talking about an allocation of land as opposed to a strategic policy in that respect. So yes, it deals with a strategic location, site/settlements on those 3 policies, but they are in the context of allocations within the plan. So we feel as though they are in an appropriate location within the plan. Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. But
just one other point. I mean, in terms of legibility for the general public, I think if you're working your way through the plan, we try to set it out so it's logically, there's sort of a logical progression, and all the settlement strategies are grouped together in the S policies. And I think there's a certain logic to that for the public if they're reviewing the plan. You've got your strategies for your specific settlements and then the strategy for the new settlements and the sites. So I do think that aids with the sort of legibility of the plan.
I do take that, I understand that now. The only thing that I would then say is that in terms of the hierarchy, is there an argument that the strategic settlement and site policies would come before settlement policies? I think just something to, because they are tucked at the back. Seems a bit. It seems a bit strange in terms of the like legibility. And I take your point about having all of your geographic specific stuff together, but just something to think about.
I think, yeah, we can have a think about that. I mean, just as a point, there was no intention of trying hiding them away at the back of the plan or anything like that. It was just there had to be a final part of the plan. I think we can consider that. As I said, we think they are more appropriately located in this section of the plan rather than the strategic bit of the plan, but where they sit within the non-strategic policies, the site allocations policies, we can consider that. My initial view is they're probably appropriate where they are, but if there was a concern about that, which impacted on the effectiveness of the plan, which I think is probably what the point being here, we can obviously consider a change of that, just a sort of a lift and shift, I suppose, on that one.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll move on to policy S20. A lot of what we've discussed is actually, as I said, is relevant to that, equally to this. So in terms under discussion point 1, is the policy justified, effective, consistent with national policy? Again, I've got your written submissions, and I've got the written submissions of other people. I'm just going to, Mrs. Crosby is just want to say something.
Yeah, just a small point. For when we come to a break, I'm conscious it's 11 o'clock. I just wanted to make the point. Kerry's been in touch, and the council are going to turn off their equipment during the break time and at lunchtime to let it cool down, because that
Right.
seemed to be causing them problems
Okay.
yesterday. So it's just to make other people aware that I think everybody else stays on, but the council will turn theirs off. Okay.
I'll just go back to the council. Like to just push on a little bit further, conscious of sort of timing, if we can though. So I think on this discussion point, obviously I've got all of the written submissions, which I just propose to take as read. But something that I would like to just ask the council is about the necessity of the policy in light of the planning history. At the time that the policy was written, and indeed up until you submitted your response to the matters, issues and questions, the outstanding legal agreements haven't been signed. Has there been any change to that, or is that still the position?
Thank you, Mrs. Dillon. Yes, they've not yet been signed, but we do understand that they're at a very advanced stage. So it is sort of imminent, if you like. If
Right.
that helps.
And am I, just for my understanding, am I correct that the reason why this policy, this site is still within the plan is it'll be to do with the fact that work hasn't started yet, you don't have a permitted scheme as yet, therefore the development hasn't started, and it extends for a long period of time. So that is why it's still within the plan, although there's a planning context to it at the moment.
Yes, Mrs. Dillon, that's exactly the case. And I draw parallels to our proposed approach to save site allocations. Obviously, a significant number of them are at advanced stages, either being built, but it provides sort of a continuity and certainty in terms of the expectations of the development that's taking place.
And the context of section 73 applications.
And a context for section 73 applications.
Thank you. Yeah, just wanted to check my understanding on that. Now I'm not proposing to explore that the justification, effectiveness and consistency of because we do have we've got all of that written material, and it isn't raising any other questions that I want to sort of explore. Is there anything from the participants? No, so we will move on. Okay, and that really we've covered number 2, discussion point 2 as well. I've got a timeline and a detailed summary of resume of the planning history of the site, and we now know that it hasn't significantly changed since that. In respect to discussion point 3, again, I've got a lot of written submission.
Madam, can we, Mrs. Dillon, can we just check when you're talking about discussion points?
Yeah.
We're a bit confused as to whether the numbering system you're using is the agenda for today.
Yes.
Or whether it's some earlier version.
No, it should be the agenda for today.
Because, I mean, for example, in the last one, Clive Barracks, you went on to discussion points 6 and 7, which we don't have. But they were under an earlier iteration of the question.
1A. I think all the questions are there, and it's just not the
They're
same.
not in the order.
They're not.
Yeah, I beg your pardon.
As somebody famously once said. Sorry, sorry for that interruption, but it just seems to be important that when you're calling for, in particular, the other participants to jump in when they want to jump in, that they need to be clear which springboard they're on.
Okay. I have to go onto the website to see if you just bear with me. Where I am at the moment is in terms of whether the landscape, flood risk, noise, air quality, natural heritage assets, etc., have been carried out to inform the development site.
That's our agenda item 2. If it
assists,
yes, if it assists anybody else.
Yes, I think what's happened. Yeah. Yes, right. I see what's happened. Okay, yes. So it is agenda item 2. I beg your pardon. So again, I've got all of the written submissions, and I'm not proposing any supplementary questions in that, and it's whether or not the council wishes to draw my attention to anything else, or if any of the participants wish to speak.
The council doesn't have anything further to add.
Okay, and is there anyone else? Okay, so we'll now be on to discussion point 3, which is whether the necessary infrastructure requirements to support the site occasion have been adequately identified and costed. Now, in that regard, I've got the written submissions of the council again and some representors, and I've received representation in respect to particularly around concerns about Gaskell Corner and the wider road network, and I think that was Mr. Turner who is here, and the much Wenlock grouping. So I'm wondering, before I invite the council to respond, if either of those participants are wanting to say anything at that point. I think that this is sort of a relevant point for their representation. So if I begin with Mr. Turner first of all, and I can ask Mr. Thomas and Mr. to switch off your camera at the moment, and then I'll come to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Dillon. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you, madam, and good morning all. And I also like to thank Mr. Richards for helping clarify whether we're on 2 or 3. I must admit, I wondered whether it was just me. So
no, my numbering's gone wrong on my screen. I've something. It's with adding in supplementary questions. My number, so I apologise for that. I'm back onto my paper agenda now.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm glad we're all on the same page. I know you've read my Regulation 19 submission and my submission to the hearing, and I know you'll be aware that the mixed-use development of 1,000+ houses was approved second time round by the planning committee, and I know you'll be aware that the decision notice, well, you mentioned it just now, planning application still not been issued 10 months later. The council indicates in its response to matter 7 at para 4.2, many of the infrastructure requirements associated with the development represent fundamental components of the scheme, and as such will be embedded within the development. So I'll endeavour not to run through my points in detail again, but simply to ask that the council identifies what considerations being given to the following, which are not embedded within the development, and they are namely the reduction in the bus travel fund of £100,000 to subsidise primary health provision, which was mentioned by Mr. Corden a bit earlier on, when the clinical commissioning group turned down an opportunity to cite on the development. The absence of any proposal for a bus service to anywhere other than Telford. The increased traffic arising from the expansion of William Brooks Secondary School to accommodate a further 160 students, and to say nothing of the volume of traffic generated by 1,000 plus households. The adequacy of the highways proposals that include a condition covering proposed traffic calming works on the B4380 at Buildwas, Leighton and Atcham, and a financial contribution of a mere £350,000 towards improvements at the A4169 Smithfield Road, A458 Victoria Road, Bridgenorth Road Junction, i.e. the Gaskell Arms at Much Wenlock, which, ma'am, you mentioned just at the beginning there. And I think that these I would describe as addressing a best case scenario. And I'm going to just move on to what I think is probably a more realistic approach. And I asked the questions against the background of the following: the knowledge that by the clinical commissioning group's own admission, local medical practices were all over capacity in 2020, and heaven knows what the position is today. And when I say over capacity, the figures quoted by the CCG were Broseley 80% over capacity, Much Wenlock 55% over capacity, Cressidge 55% over capacity, and Ironbridge 45% over capacity. And these are all the nearest medical practices. Secondly, the cumulative impact of other development identified in the local plan review in Much Wenlock, slated optimistically for only 200 houses, Cressidge for 60 houses, Bridgenorth 1,500 houses, and further development in Broseley and Shrewsbury. And that's to say nothing, of course, of the continued growth of Telford just a couple of miles up the road. At a time when sustainable and local food production is at the front of our minds and we're enjoying good weather, we think of the harvest. In a timely comment yesterday, Mr. Harding from Lambert Smith Hampton made reference to agricultural traffic and the suitability of the highways to accommodate it, along with other rather more agile vehicular movement. I've made reference to this in my submissions as well. Over the coming weeks, we'll see agricultural machinery and crops dominating not only country lanes locally, but also the B4380, the A4169 and the A458. During this period in particular, every year, we see traffic slowly crawling up the A4169 towards Much Wenlock out of the Severn Valley behind heavily laden tractors, and we see traffic being halted informally to allow combine harvesters and the like to pass repeatedly during the day at the Victoria Road Causeway on the A458, on the Holloway adjacent to the Gaskell Arms on the B4378. Separately, and this hasn't been addressed anywhere I can see, issues around the knock-on effect of closure of the Wharfage and Ironbridge and the Cressidge Bridge on the B4380 during increasingly frequent flood events. That's when the River Severn overtops. It's very much more common than it was when I first came here 30 years ago or so. Thrust more traffic onto the 4380 to Atcham, which is at Attingham Park, the A4169 through Much Wenlock, and 5 long single track lanes around Much Wenlock, which for much of their mileage is in poor condition already. I conclude by saying that the developers of the power station site successfully persuaded the council that there was no further funding available beyond that indicated in the final iteration of its planning approval, hence the regrettable shortfall in affordable housing. On this basis, I believe we have to be very careful to avoid bringing local communities to their knees due to the inability of council or developers to fund shortfalls once this development rolls out. Ma'am, in absence of any convincing assurance from the council on these matters, I submit that the infrastructure requirements associated with the former Ironbridge power station strategic settlement have not been adequately identified and costed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm wondering whether to the council, can I just ask you to switch your camera on, whether you want to listen to Mr. Thomas and Mr. White first and then respond after that, or whether you would like to respond to Mr. Turner now. Obviously, I'm aware that this the current planning application, and I don't want to be drawn into I'm examining this policy and not the merits of the of the current planning application. So would you prefer that we move on to Mr. Thomas and Mr. White first, council? I'm wondering, could the council switch their camera on?
I'm thinking, madam, that maybe the council's heat's got the better of them.
I think so as well. I'm just wondering if Kerry, if you have any idea if there is an issue with the council. It seems as if there is, in which case
I do have the facility to chat with the council, but there's no message on my chat at the moment.
right.
No,
What we will do is we will take a break now. I think we'll do a break anyway, so we'll take a break and so that we can try and get to find out and hopefully resolve any technical issues with the council. So what we will do is we'll break for 10 minutes. So if you can come back at 11:25, please. Thank you.
Yeah, it does. Okay, so back at the turn. Good. That all.
Hello, it's 11:25. If we could resume. I think Mrs. Crosby, you have some announcement to make.
Yeah, can I just check that the council are back in the room before we start? I know they were having some technical problems. Right,
Yes,
great.
we are. And against the day that we might have further problems, we're now rigging up a separate big screen and camera in here so that we have two things logged into the session that we can switch between if necessary.
Excellent. Always good to have a backup plan. I was just going to say a few things about the programme because I'm conscious that we've got Matter 8 people sort of waiting in another room, a virtual room, but Kerry's having problems there as well. People keep getting kicked out for some reason. It's looking like this session, Matter 7, is going to run on a little bit longer than we maybe expected, but hopefully no longer than sort of 12:30 we're thinking. And then what with the idea I've got is that then we have a shorter lunch break. So even if we finish at 12:20 or 12:30, we'll break till 1 o'clock and then come back and deal with Matter 8. And that allows that sort of switch over from 7 to 8. Does that suit the council? Does that give you long enough to grab a sandwich? And
Yes, that's absolutely fine. We can accommodate lunch in that time frame.
okay, that's great. And for people at home, that's probably not too much of an issue, hopefully. So it just kind of keeps it a little bit neater in terms of getting people in and out and things. Okay, thank you. I'll pass you back.
Okay, can I just, council, we aren't entirely sure at what point you lost connection. Did you hear Mr. Turner's?
Yes, we did. Yes.
Yeah, we heard all of Mr. Turner. And then we heard you saying, "Ooh, we've lost the council." And we heard you say, in that case, we'll have a break now for 10 minutes. So we heard absolutely everything.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Okay, that's good then. What I wanted to know is, do you want to address Mr. Turner's points now, or would you prefer to listen to Mr. Thomas and Mr. White first and then address everything at the end, just in case there's some overlap? Or
shall we hear them all? I think. And
yes.
Then we'll respond at the end.
Okay then. So thank you, Mr. Turner, and if we can move on to Mr. Thomas now, please. Hello there.
Hi, thank you, Mrs. Dillon. So as you can see from the town, it's Dan Thomas. I'm representing Much Runlock Town Council, the wider community of Much Runlock, as a former mayor and our current member on Shropshire Council. As you can see from our written submissions, Buildworth's power station traffic model wasn't done accurately. As a way of background, Harworth used the Visio model on all roads out of Buildworth, but then ditched it to use Google Maps coming towards Much Runlock. So the modelling is wrong, but even so, it shows that the delays at the Gaskell corner are doubled. So my first question is, Are Shropshire Council aware of this cause and the seriousness of the rat running problem in Much Wenlock? And if they are, then why have they approved a development SP20 that will more than double the delays and increase this rat running? And finally, with respect to SP20 and the town of Much Wenlock, do you think the answer to matter 7, question 4A is yes or no? And that's it really. So yeah, big problem with rat running.
Thank you. And obviously we need to be mindful of it's that thing about what I'm examining is the policy, not a current plan application. It's always a little bit difficult because there's a little bit of overlap and you sort of getting a bit of a it's almost things back to front happening back to front. So but I can only really listen to the arguments in the context of the policy itself, not what planning application or whatever is before us or has been considered. So thank you. And could I then just move on to Mr. White, please? Good morning.
Good morning, and nice to see you, and thank you very much for being allowed this opportunity. Yeah, I wanted to reinforce a point to do with the transport infrastructure, to do with the effective costing. Well, I represent, sorry, by the way, I'm the mayor of Much Wenlock, and I'm representing obviously the people of Much Wenlock in this case. The effective costing, certainly in our opinion, is just ineffective, in so much as it was initially 250,000, then increased by a further 100,000. That 100,000 was taken from another fund, which was for transport links. So really, it's a question of robbing Peter to pay Paul. Still at 350,000, it is still totally inadequate to deal with the problem, which undoubtedly, as my colleagues and friends have already highlighted, will considerably alter the transport problems at the Gaskell Corner. Yes, it's the Gaskell Corner again issue, I'm afraid. What really worries me is that this 350 amount has been accepted by Shropshire Council, having previously rejected the plan that was submitted to try and solve, in inverted commas, the problems, which they clearly rejected themselves as we agreed with them. Why is it that we're accepting 350,000 as an infrastructure alteration, which clearly it is inadequate, it is not costed properly, and will certainly not solve the problem? There's no way that amount of money will actually have any effect. We'll be looking to get a few speed bumps. So I'm afraid that is a very, very important point from the people of Much Wenlock, that we feel that it is not adequately identified or costed. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and thank you, Mr. White. I'll now invite the council to respond. Now, I'm conscious that some of what we've heard may well be tied up with the issues around the planning application. If I'm understanding the representations correctly, and obviously the purpose of this examination is to examine the policy, not the proposal that has come before the policy. If you say, yeah,
Mrs. Dillon, I think we, like you've already recognised, I think this is not the usual order of things, if you like, which perhaps is inevitable that these things happen in some instances due to the nature of the plan making process. I think we agree with you. The issues raised are issues that were considered during the planning application process. That application was, of course, informed by transport assessment, and our Highways Authority considered that, and their expertise informed the decision-making process. So we do consider those issues have been considered appropriately through that mechanism. So I think, in effect, that's our response to the queries that have been raised. They were considered during the planning application process, and the decision was reached our resolution was reached to grant that planning permission based on the information that was provided.
Now, I think the question that I'll ask is, if in a scenario where the current proposals that the council have determined didn't happen, it didn't occur, and we had this so the site was basically back to not having a current planning context. To what extent is this policy going to be effective in managing the types of concerns that we've heard from Mr. White, Mr. Thomas, and Mr. Turner? I think that's probably the way to deal with it, if we can deal with it in that way.
Yes, I think, obviously, first I'd say we're of the view that the planning permission is going to be issued, and obviously we've already talked about the advanced stage of the section 106, but yeah, taking the scenario you presented at sort of face value, if you like, we consider that the guidelines provide that structure for achieving an appropriate development on the site, and we make specific reference to paragraph 3G. Obviously, it does use the word appropriate transport assessment, and we've heard your comments on that, and I think we've already discussed the fact that we'll obviously go away and have a careful consideration of the explanatory text to the policies to provide maybe a bit more explanation, if you like. So hopefully, does that give you a bit more comfort on that issue?
It's you responding to those concerns of those people. From what I can understand, the concerns that have been raised, as say, are centre more around the decision making on the current sort of planning context, rather than the soundness of this policy itself. So I think what I would do is just on this occasion, I would invite any of the previous speakers, if they wish to reframe their concerns around the actual wording of this policy in the scenario that the current planning proposal, which has been determined by the council. See if that wasn't on the table, and we were looking at it as a proposal that doesn't have that planning context. So, Mr. White, do you want to say anything?
Yes, I would just like to ask and frame a question around my submission, if I could, please.
It's more about it's not necessarily about asking questions. It's about you. It's about you giving me your opinion,
Okay, then. My opinion then is this plan does not effectively identify, but more importantly, cost an adequate level of transport infrastructure changes suitable for the plan. That's my submission.
Okay, thank you. And that is in relation to this policy, as opposed to the regardless of your views on the previous planning application. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's right. I just want to absolutely understand. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Thomas.
Yeah, my question is, does the Shropshire Council think the answer to matter 7 question 4A regarding infrastructure, that the answer is yes? Have they actually got the right infrastructure for Much of Unlock? Because I think that they fail on that policy. Yeah.
Okay, right. So, and Mr. Turner, thank you, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas, Mr. Turner wanting to speak on that.
I haven't unmuted. You'd think after all this time I'd have learned.
It catches us all out.
My challenge, my question is given that questions Mr. Thomas, Mr. White have already spoken, is around the council's assertion that in terms of healthcare, it is adequately catered for that.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, and I'll just invite the council. Would you just like to, if you'd just like to respond on the base, if we put that planning application to one side and we're just thinking about the policy, it's that issue around, can you point me to where you've got sort of you've got costings for the infrastructure, the transport infrastructure, and also the healthcare provision place. So how does the policy effectively deal with that? Those matters.
Thank you, Mrs. Dillon. In terms of the policy mechanisms, I think we've already discussed the fact that we consider that there are effective mechanisms in place that will allow for these issues to be appropriately addressed. But obviously, we've already caveat that with the fact that we've already recognised that there may be an opportunity to expand on the explanatory text.
Yeah.
In terms of the costings, I mean, it's a difficult one to separate from the planning application process, because obviously our view has always been on any allocation, in fact, that we have a set level of information that you have for an allocation, and then that's clearly refined as you go further through the planning process and you reach the planning application stage. And this is a good example of the fact that the level of information available to you does refine, and you become more certain in terms of what the specific interventions required for that particular development are, and what is appropriate to achieve those interventions, if you like. So without wanting to refer back to the planning application, it's difficult not to, because obviously that's gone through that more detailed assessment and identified what it considers to be appropriate contributions in order to facilitate the development. So I think, unfortunately, that inevitably is going to have to be the way that we deal with it. And as I say, it's in some ways it's a reflection of what happens in the planning application process more widely, but obviously this one's been rather concertinaed down because of the fact that the planning application came forward when it did. So on other sites, we've got the strategic guidelines, the plan would be adopted. I mean, Clive Barracks, for instance, the planning application comes forward 27, 28 time, whatever, we've got it specifically phased for. And then the guidelines would inform the assessment work that's undertaken within that application process and the master planning process associated with it. And that would inform the specific contributions that were then secured at the planning application stage. As I say, this one obviously has been concertinaed down because of the specific characteristics of the site. But I think that does give you confidence in terms of the interventions required and the deliverability of them.
If I may, it was a point that I made earlier, but I think it's useful to just to reiterate really. It's quite a good example of the system working in this respect, with policy working because of where we are with the planning application process, because of it has happened effectively in a linear process with the plan making process. It's difficult to identify specific funding outcomes for particular elements at the more strategic level. When you get down to the planning application, there has clearly been a process through a more wider assessment, utilising information as part of that planning application process from the developer in order to arrive at a figure, and that figure in terms of a highway contribution is the fair and equitable figure for what we consider the impact of that contribution on the network. It's so that's the sort of the kind of, I suppose, reality of the situation. But I understand that your point in terms of the certainty at the plan making part. I think our response to that is we can do what we can seek to achieve at that point in process, but it's always going to be a point in process, and we're not going to have that level of specificity at that point in time.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I understand everybody's position, so we'll move on from that. Thank you very much, everybody. So I think we're at point 5 of under policy S20 now, according to my hard copy agenda. So appendix F of the council's 5-year house and land supply statement annexes shows that there's an expected delivery rate between 2024-25 initial rate of 70 dwellings per annum, and concerns have been raised that this is over optimistic. And I'm just wondering, is the response a similar response to the council's response? Is it a similar response to the response that we heard earlier in respect to the previous site?
Yeah, it's I'll respond to that if I may. It's on behalf of the developer. Yeah, it is a similar response, but I think just to shed some light on the commencement of developments in terms of those first delivery rates coming in 2024-25. We're working on the basis that the Section 106 agreement will be completed in August, and the enabling works application is primed and ready to go together with the commencement of discharge of the pre-commencement conditions the day after the planning permission is issued. And on that basis, the Harworth as the master developer will be commencing the development at the end of this year. Marketing on phase 1, which is the first phase of 110 dwellings, is underway at the moment. Market interest is strong, and I would consider a reserve matters application for phase 1 is likely to be submitted by a house builder in quarter 2 2023, and I'll be keen to get on site and start building their houses by quarter 4 2023. Work is already commencing on phase 2 in terms of the earthworks, and the marketing will follow soon after that. It's my expectation is that there'll be 2 outlets on the site from 2025. I would estimate. So my opinion, the assumptions are not optimistic. They're probably cautious, actually, given the experience of the master developer involved and the strong market interest and our understanding of market absorption rates in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any participants who wish to raise anything in regard to this? And then in regard to discussion point 6, whether the policy should be included in the strategic policy section, we've already discussed that. Has the council got anything else to say about that?
I think we just refer to the previous discussion we've had.
Yeah, thank you. Just want to check that my supplementary questions, see that we've covered everything. Yeah. Covered everything that I want to do for that site, and obviously I'm informed also by the discussion that we had on the first site, some of the sort of generic issues that we've looked at. And before we move on to RAF Cosford site, is there anyone who needs to be given an opportunity to say something that they haven't already said, something that doesn't either they've missed an opportunity elsewhere on the agenda, or something that hasn't been covered but is pertinent? Is there anybody who's expecting to be able to say something that they haven't been able to? Okay, thank you. Now we'll move on then to RAF Cosford, and that's policy S21 of the plan. So in terms of discussion point 1, which is whether the policy is justified, effective, consistent with national plan and policy, again, it's just, we just cover it. It was this, I don't plan to have any further discussion because it just those generic issues that I covered earlier on. So all I would ask is that the council, when they're looking at modification, that they reflect on this policy as well. Is there anything that the council you wish to add?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Dillon. Yes, we will of course reflect on the previous discussion. One thing I will say, of course, is that this is a strategic site, so the nature of the development is somewhat different. But we will reflect on that when we're undertaking that exercise.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, I understand the difference between that, so that's good. Thank you. Is there anybody that's present that wishes to say anything in respect to discussion point 1 about whether the policy is justified, effective, and consistent with national policy? Ms. McCabe?
Thank you, Inspector Dillon. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Thank you. I'm Jodie McCabe. I'm from the Defence Infrastructure Organisation, which is part of the MOD.
Can I just check first of all, are you speaking, is this in support, this is with
respect to sort of our outstanding comments. on the policy. It's just
Yeah, right, okay. Right,
just
that's
a minor comment,
yeah.
really. I won't go into details on that.
Yeah.
We've only got 2 minor points
Yeah,
outstanding,
okay.
which is fully covered, I think, within my hearing
Yeah.
statement and the statement of common ground. It was just a comment, really, just to say I welcome the reference earlier to the potential for addition to the explanatory text of the policy. I think certainly one, and if not both, of our outstanding issues could potentially be covered with some additional explanatory text, just to provide a bit more clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Councillor, is there anything you want to add to that, or are you happy to move on to?
Yeah, we're happy to move on. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Just having a little bit of difficulty with my mouse to be able to navigate, so just bear with me a moment. So moving on to discussion point 2, I mean, yesterday, and this is in respect to Greenbelt. So discussion point 2 was around whether there have been material changes in circumstances since earlier proposals to remove this site from the Greenbelt, and whether there are now exceptional circumstances to justify its removal from the Greenbelt. So we discussed Greenbelt issues at matter 6 yesterday, and reference was made to this particular site. I'm just wondering, I'll just invite the council first of all, if they'd like to comment on that, any further, you know, if there's anything any further or anything they wanted to draw my attention to, which is in their written submissions, and then I'll open that to anyone who's here that has made representation and wishes to speak on that point.
Thank you, Mrs. Dillon. Yeah, I think in the first instance, I'd refer to our response to the relevant question. I mean, with specific regard to the exceptional circumstances issues that have been identified, factors if you like, we do consider those to be unique at this moment in time. They are other moments in time. The opportunities that have been identified with regards to the nature and characteristics of the site are based on the status of the site as it is now, and the opportunities before us at this point in time that have been identified by the various site occupiers. So I think our position is that the information before you that's been presented in our matter statement is relevant as at this point in time, and we consider that those factors effectively we consider those represent reasonable exceptional circumstances, and they are relevant at this point in time.
There's just one other thing that has occurred to me, Mrs. Dillon. If this was a village, in inverted commas, then we would be looking at paragraph 144 in the framework. And we'd be deciding whether to inset it or have it washed over or leave it washed over by the Greenbelt. Now, it's not technically a village, but the same approach is logical. Because it's an RAF base where all sorts of activities go on. And therefore, if you approach it from that direction and say, well, what would we do if this was a village? I think the answer is obvious. You'd inset it.
Is there anything else that anyone wishes to Okay. I've got a couple of people have their hands up. So I've got Mr. Now I may pronounce your name incorrectly. I'm really sorry if I do. Mr. Brogden or Brogden? Or could you switch your microphone on, please?
Apologies. It's Richard Brogden. It's a common challenge to get my surname, so that's fine.
Do apologise.
That's fine. I'm here on behalf of Shifnal Town Council and Shifnal Matters, and there's a couple of comments I think that just I want to make now, and no doubt there'll be others in a minute, but just reference the last comment about insetting as if it was a village. My comment would be there, if that was being proposed, I don't think the area that's identified would be put forward. And therefore, I don't think it's appropriate at this stage to approach it on that basis. What I think I've understood from this morning's conversations is the reason it's a strategic site is because of scale. And that raises the concern as to the scale of development that's could come forward and whether that has been properly addressed through the employment analysis and allocation. We've made reference to the fact that previously that if it was to be properly addressed, we're effectively adding 50% area to the employment analysis, and that's not been undertaken. So I think there's a fundamental concern that if employment land is allocated of a scale which is proposed, it's not actually been taken into account in the previous analysis by the council. And that, I think, sort of picks up those 2 points. There are other points, but I think we'll come on to those in a minute. So rather than making a whole host of points that are potentially out of order, I'll stop at that.
Lovely, thank you. Could I ask the council just to come back on if you can share any thoughts on that with me in respect to what Mr. Brogden said?
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Dillon. Yeah, I think the first point is to recognise the fact that a substantial amount of the site is already built form. It's not like we're proposing. We do specify the size of the site. It's 200 odd hectares. It's not like we're suggesting all that would be for development. There's already existing built form in there. What the strategic site seeks to do is to facilitate the intensification and expansion activities that are proposed in association with the existing users and the opportunities that they have identified on that site. I think that's an important point. The second point is they're not employment uses in the sense that Mr. Brogden suggested. It's specifically for military and charity use. It's not anticipated as an employment site as such. It is to facilitate the activities of those existing occupiers. So we do think that's very distinct from the wider sort of employment allocations, if you like. We are of the view that the way it's been identified in the plan provides clarity on its purpose and its role, and I think that's important. And we also consider the approach in terms of its relationship to our employment land is very clear in terms of how we structured it. So that would be my thoughts.
No, I think you've mentioned everything, Mr. Gordon. Obviously, a key aspect of this is the facilitation the expansion of the museum there as well. So there are specific issues, specific characteristics of the site and the location and uniqueness of the site, which we think lend itself to the exceptional circumstances argument. And the built form on the site, I think, is a particularly relevant part of that consideration as well. We have to think about, is it seeking to form a viable use if it was retained in the green belt because of what's happened there already? So I think that's a part of our consideration. So yeah, I think that's all we've got to say for the moment on that.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Tarrant. Good afternoon now.
Good afternoon. You can hear me all right?
I can, yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't think that there has really been any change in circumstances. You heard earlier that this removal of greenbelt was considered by a previous inspector on the former Bridge North District local plan. From my memory at that time, I seem to recall it was Defence Estates who asked for its removal at the time because they were carrying out a defence review, and it would have helped their valuation on the asset register not to have that constraint on it. The then Bridge North Council were, however, very concerned that the site formed part of a very vulnerable and strategic buffer of greenbelt between Wolverhampton and Telford. With Shifnal and Brighton already as insets, there was concern that to do the same for Cosford would leave this large area which outside the greenbelt, which could compromise its objective, and you'd have these three insets close to each other with just small strips of greenbelt between. The then council recognised the site was unique with just defence and air ambulance use, and that future developments of these could still be allowed relatively unhindered through appropriate policies rather than removal from the greenbelt. My recollection is that the inspector did accept this argument, and that retention of the greenbelt would enable greater planning control in the future should these unique uses cease to be required, as the impact of unrelated development on such a large site on the area would be substantial. Shropshire Council referred to providing confidence and certainty. However, since 1991, there have been over 70 development proposals that have gone ahead on the site, including nearly 80 houses, substantial accommodation and teaching blocks, and a massive Cold War museum building. This must not indicate any greenbelt negative impact on confidence or certainty to justify exceptional circumstances. Another exceptional circumstances claimed for removal is the need for a new air ambulance hub. Yet the council has now approved this development, even though it's in the greenbelt, and construction has started, which contradicts the view that this was restricted by being in the greenbelt. It also indicates that the exceptional circumstances for removing this part of the site no longer apply, and there's no reason not to retain it within the greenbelt. We heard just a moment ago that the issue seems to be facilitating existing occupiers. If that was the sole case, then even if it was felt appropriate to remove Cosford, excluding the ambulance site from the greenbelt, to meet the development needs of defence and the museum, this could be done by simply removing the site from the greenbelt with appropriate policies to control future development of these uses, not then designating it as a strategic site. The council stressed the unique defence and charitable activities, but it's clear from other statements that there are wider objectives of the council to that. Designating the site as a strategic site enables a wide range of non-defence charitable related developments to be approved at its will with no great control. And indeed, in paragraph 242 of their GC4 statement, they state that the strategic site is considered to represent a future urban area. Also, and we note that since early 2019, the council has been advertising the site in its Invest in Shropshire brochure as a future investment opportunity site, which they described on their website as a long-term aspirational site for mixed use and as a potential new employment site that the council will consider making available for development. I do not consider, therefore, that these as yet unspecified, undefined, aspirational, non-defence charitable developments to enable Cosford to become a future urban area and or mixed-use employment site under a strategic site designation constitute the exceptional circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I invite the council to respond to the points that Mr. Tarrant has made, please?
Thank you, Mrs. Dillon.
I'm particularly interested in the approach that you've taken to deciding to propose to remove from the green belt to and the potential for unrelated uses that aren't related to the defence user, the scope for that.
Thank you, Mrs. Dillon. Yeah. First and foremost, I'd actually thank Mr. Tarrant for his clarification on the considerations at the time of the Bridge North local planning examination. Obviously, I think it very much highlights the difference to the current circumstances. Whilst Mr. Tarrant described it as a sort of a land value exercise, I think it's very different now. The DIO has specifically identified RAF Cosford as a receiver site within two of their assessments. That's actually referenced in the explanation to the policy in paragraphs 7.5 and 7.6. So effectively, it has been identified as a location where they are going to focus defence activities. That's a specific part of their strategy, and particularly the defence training. And that very much links to the opportunities that have been identified by the landowners. So I do think that's very different to the circumstances that Mr. Tarrant described at the Bridge North local plan examination. I also think.
Can I just a question that I've got then? So do you think that the policy, if that's the intention, does the policy adequately control and limit those future uses or future developments to that user?
Yeah, so our view is very much this policy is to enable the defence and charitable uses that occur on the site to take place. I would point to paragraph 3 of the policy that talks about what the site is for. Sorry, is it? Yeah, so paragraph 3 talks about facilitate the intensification and expansion of the RAF Museum Cosford, and hosting the Specialist Aviation Academy, supporting the opportunities to co-locate other Ministry of Defence activities, and its role as a centre of excellence for both UK and international defence training. It's very specific that those are the activities that it envisages on it, and I think the guidelines associated with the site are specifically directed towards those uses.
But why does it support those uses? Does it actually restrict other uses, other uses that aren't related to that user?
Well, the policy's been written in a positive manner.
Yeah.
To advertise, I suppose, promote the types of use we would be seeking. It's not a negatively worded policy in that context.
So would it prohibit an unrelated development, a development that's not related to the current RAF charitable uses? Something came along, would this policy allow it?
Well,
or would it be restricted by this policy?
Our expectation is that it's specifically facilitating those users and not other users. And I think the other factor to recognise, of course, it is in the Ministry of Defence's ownership. Now, I don't want to speak for the MOD. I know Jodie is obviously on the call, so maybe she can give you some clarification in terms of the fact that the uses intended are their uses in effect.
So once it's removed from the green belt, it becomes a non-green belt site, and obviously doesn't then have the same policy protection consideration. So if what I'm asking is, by removing it from the green belt, and in terms of the way that this policy is written, is this policy written in an effective manner which would if the whole justification is based upon facilitating the current users' aspirations, is the policy effective in ensuring that that is all that it does? Or is it opening a door for other development? Because I think that's my understanding is what the concern is of people that have made representation about this site. Putting it bluntly and in very stark terms. I think that's what the nub of it is.
Well, it's good to be blunt in this context. I think that is what we've taken from the concerns and what you've indicated. The intention of the policy, we believe, is clear, that it would limit the types of development to those uses we just described, because we are told to write policies in a positively worded manner and to avoid negatively worded policies. However, if there is a concern about the tone of the policy in that context, and you think that leads to an issue with the effective nature of that policy, we can seek to consider a main modification to make that intention clearer.
Okay, yeah. So sorry, I'll let Mr. Corden continue because I had interrupted at that point.
Yeah, I think I only had one other point to make, which was, of course, Mr. Tarrant also referenced the development that had taken place since 2006, which again is another example of the fact that the circumstances are very different now than they were when this was previously considered. So yeah, I think it probably very much links to the point Mr. Richards made. In fact, the characteristics of the site are there is substantial built form there. So yeah, I think that would be my response at this point.
And this is what would be the implication on the uses on this, the current users or user of the site? What would be the implication if this site wasn't taken out of it wasn't actually taken out of the green belt? Given we've heard that there's been numerous planning applications, support, because the uniqueness of the site and the use is there regardless of whether it's in green belt or not. So what is the well, why does it have to come out of the green belt.
It was a point of clarity, really, and I think it's to give clarity to well, the reader and the community and the development industry as well, and indeed the owner of the site. Now, but in terms of I'll start to talk legalistically if Mr. Richards might want to take over, but we understand the bar for very special circumstances. Case law would indicate that bar is higher than the level for exceptional circumstances. So obviously, with that being the case, you feel as though that leads to a need to address this as part of the plan making process, rather than to seek to defer it to any specific planning application later down the line. I think it also, in fairness, if you remove it from the greenbelt, the policy also talks about master planning as well. That does help to facilitate that wider master plan process, rather than this sort of incremental, very special circumstances arguments, which would need to be made over time. It's a point of clarity and certainty, really, on that point.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Mr. Brogden and Mr. Tarrant, you still have your hands raised. I don't know if they're legacy hands, or whether there is a pertinent point. I don't want sort of backwards and forwards, and I'm conscious of the that we haven't been doing. We sort of haven't been doing that through. But if there's a particular point that I need to be aware of, that's fair enough.
Yes, Mrs. Dillon, it's Richard Brogden again. I think there is. It's the point you raised about whether there is the policy has sufficient control, and we don't believe it does. Particularly if you look at the council's own response, paragraph 3.7 to matter 7, where they make reference to wanting flexibility. And I think that raises concerns, particularly as you heard from Trevor, that the council are advertising there's investment prospects on the site which aren't restricted to the uses that they're postulating. So I think there is a very much a fundamental concern that by removing it out of the green belt, its use will be a wider scale employment use than we've just heard it's proposed for. By leaving it in the green belt, the uses that are currently existing and subsidiary uses can continue. But I think it's that point of scale and control compared to, I should say, the flexibility that the council are trying to unlock.
Okay, I understand your point. Thank you very much. And Mr. Tarrant, was there anything that you had wanted to any point that you were wanting to make?
Just one short point following what the council just said. I mean, as well as the removing of the green belt, the other main concern which I've raised is its designation as a strategic site. Note from experience that people will use whichever policy suits them best. And although we've had references to policy S21 as giving sufficient controls, by being a strategic site, then all the general economic development policies relating to strategic corridors, strategic settlements, strategic sites will come into play. And by designating it as such, enables anyone to put forward a case, an overriding case for such development under those policies, rather than trying to restrict it to policy S21. Thank you.
Right, and just finally, before we move on, I just give the council, if there is an opportunity, if you want to say anything more about the points that have been raised. And obviously, I will go away and consider what I've heard.
Yeah, I don't think there's any thing we want to come back on really. I suppose I know I want to say one thing about the Invest in Shropshire website though. I know it's been raised by a couple of people, well, a couple of the participants. It seems to be, just having a quick look, it does seem to be related to the wider corridor. Right, it is mentioned, but it's in the wider corridor that it's being sort of advertised as that location. It's probably one we need to have a discussion with our Invest in Shropshire colleagues on.
Yeah, I mean that is it is a it does suggest. I'm wondering why would it be being advertised in that regard if it's got an end user, and it seems to jar a bit.
I think the idea is it's trying to promote the fact that the corridor already has sort of these activities going on, and as we discussed yesterday, sort of advanced manufacturing engineering is very much key sectors in Shropshire, and we see the RAF Cosford as sort of an example of those activities in Shropshire. But yes, I think as
for that user, yeah. I think that's something that in our when we're going to be writing to you anyway, and I think it's something that I would like some more clarity on, to be quite honest.
Sorry, on this point particularly.
On this point particular, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll obviously we do have the Invest in Shropshire website is run by our economic growth team. We have close links with our economic growth department. I think this might be a case of where the world of planning and economic growth, the intentions might change somewhat for 13, but it's something we can look with them apart.
Yeah, but we'll write to you on that on that point, so you know exactly what we need. So we can move on now. Just conscious of trying to stick to the agenda. Now, discussion point 3 was around the infrastructure requirements to support the site allocation. I don't have any questions in regard to those. I don't know if there's anyone else that wishes to speak about those before I invite the council. No, okay. Council, I've got all of your the written submissions in regard to this. I'm quite happy just to go and have a look at those. I don't have any other questions, unless there's anything that you wish to point out.
No, I don't think we've got anything further to add, Mrs. Dillon.
Lovely, thank you. And then discussion point 4 in terms of delivery timescales. Again, I have the position of everybody in regard to that, and just check that if there's anybody needs to raise anything about it. No. Okay, so we can move on. And then discussion point 5, and that's around we've already discussed this point in relation to the placement of the policy within the plan, and I've also heard obviously from Mr. Tarrant about the question as to it being a strategic site in the first instance, and I've also heard from the council in generic terms at the beginning of this session as to what constitutes a strategic site and why it is a strategic site. So I'm quite satisfied that I've got enough understanding of that to make a view on it if I need to. So unless I invite the council, is there anything else that you wish to say about this particular policy?
No, I don't think there's anything we want to do kind of add at the moment, Mark. So
Okay, and I'll just open that up to all the participants. Is there anything that anybody hasn't had an opportunity to say that they wanted to say in relation to the RAF Cosford site? I haven't got any hands showing. And is there anything, before we close this session, is there anything that everybody feel that they've had their say? Does anybody feel that they haven't had their say into the matters that we've been talking about today? Okay. All right. Well, with that, I propose that we close this session now. I think Mrs. Crosby may have some information for those of you who are migrating over to matter A session after the break.
Yeah, I think some people have had problems getting in this morning. I've not heard from Kerry for a while, so I assume everybody's into matter 8 now. For the benefit of people who are in this session and then will be joining matter 8, if you leave this session and go through the link that was sent to you by the programme officer, I think it was late yesterday, and we'll resume that at 1 o'clock as discussed earlier. So I've got half an hour's break now and then we'll come back at 1. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Crosby. I think, Kerry, you have your hands up. Are you wanting to? Have you got an update?
Thank you. If I could just say that I know some people are experiencing difficulties just getting into matter 8. Can I just reiterate that if during the break, if they are having problems, that they go out and come back in on the same link, please.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you everybody for your contributions this morning. Been very helpful, and I now propose that we close this session. So good afternoon, everybody.